To the archivists of the Third Petition House, from Senior Envoy Kesik Vor of the Concordant Spiral, filed in the 23rd year after the incident at the Hollow Atrium aboard Quiet Meridian. This is a personal dispatch and not a formal report. Please file it under whatever category you deem appropriate. I have stopped trying to choose categories for things that involve humans. There is a silence I have been thinking about for 23 years. It lasted 4 breath cycles, which by Vithrin reckoning is a measurable thing, not a poetic one. I counted them. I count things when I'm frightened, and I was frightened then, although I did not know why at the time. The silence happened in the Hollow Atrium, aboard the neutral station, Quiet Meridian, which orbits a dead star at the edge of the concordant trade lanes and was at the time the customary venue for low-priority cultural exchanges between member species and the new human delegation. The agenda that morning was unremarkable. 3 items. The third item was a question. A junior attaché of my own house, a young Vithrin named Veshlin, who had been credentialed only 11 days, asked the human ambassador a routine question about funeral customs. It is a question we ask every species at some point in the first century of diplomatic contact. It is not considered intrusive. It usually receives a short answer. The answer is then filed in the Cultural Bureau and consulted only when scheduling logistics for delegation members who fall ill while abroad. The human ambassador, whose name was Marian Holloway, set down her cup. She did not answer immediately. She looked at Veshlin for what I measured as 4 breath cycles, and during those 4 breath cycles I noticed 3 things. I noticed that the human delegation behind her had gone still in a way I had never seen humans go still. I noticed that the room's acoustic insulation, which is designed to muffle the small noises of diplomatic gatherings, suddenly seemed inadequate to the silence it was being asked to hold. And I noticed that Veshlin, who had asked the question in perfect common trade speech with no error or impropriety, had begun to lower her antenna the way Vithrin do when we have committed a social violation and are waiting to learn what it was. Then Marian Holloway began to speak. And what she said took the rest of the afternoon and the rest of my career and the rest of my life to understand. This dispatch is my attempt to explain it. I do not think I will succeed. I'm sending it anyway, because the archive should have a record of what happened in that room, written by someone who was in it, while I'm still capable of writing. I was at the time 41 cycles into my service. I'm 64 cycles now. My bond mate Tessic died 11 months ago. I mention this not as preamble, but as relevance. You will understand why before the end. A note to the archivists before I continue. Please ensure copies of this dispatch reach the Concordant Cultural Bureau, particularly the Standing Committee on Anomalous Practices, and if Director Olmertaz is still serving, a copy to him personally. He was the one who finally signed the order creating the new file category, and I think he should know that the envoy who witnessed the original event has, after 23 years, finally understood what it meant. I would also ask that this not be filed under routine correspondence. I would not normally request special handling. I'm requesting it now. File it, perhaps, under cultural anomalies unresolved. That is where the human file lives. That is where this dispatch belongs. I will continue. Before humans arrived, concordant diplomacy had a shape. For 11,000 years, the shape was this. A new species achieves the technological threshold for sustained interstellar contact. A concordant survey vessel makes formal approach. Initial cultural exchanges proceed through a standardized protocol developed and refined across 247 first contacts. The new species accepts membership or it does not. If it accepts, it is integrated into the trade lanes. Its citizens disperse across the galaxy, taking up positions on stations and colonies and member worlds. Its diplomatic delegations rotate. Its commercial agents settle wherever their contracts require. Within 3 generations, the new species is, for practical purposes, a concordant species. Its homeworld remains, of course, and is honored, but its citizens belong to the concordant. They live where the work is. They die where they died. Death was, in this shape, an administrative matter. Different species had different practices for the body, and the Cultural Bureau cataloged them with appropriate respect. The Thren dissolved their dead in mineral baths and used the resulting slurry to fertilize ceremonial gardens. The Olbu cremated and dispersed. The Karashi compressed and stored, returning the compressed remains to the family tomb on the homeworld when convenient, sometimes after several decades, sometimes never. We Vren returned our dead to the hive substrate of whichever colony we happened to be on at the time, mixing the kitten into the foundational pulp from which new chambers are built. It was considered honorable. It was considered practical. The dead became, in a literal sense, the walls of the next generation's home, and this satisfied us. In all of these practices, three assumptions were shared. The first assumption was that the dead, having ceased to participate in the work of the living, became a logistical problem that could be solved at the location of death. The second assumption was that distance from the homeworld was not in itself a violation of the dead. The third assumption was that the resources of the living should not be expended on the already dead beyond what custom and decency required. These three assumptions were so universal across the concordant that they were not, until the humans arrived, even articulated as assumptions. They were simply the way things were. Humans were the 248th first contact. They were, by every preliminary metric, an unremarkable species, bipedal mammals from a temperate world, modest technological achievement, reasonable language capacity, a small interstellar footprint at the time of contact, perhaps 11 colonies, a handful of stations, some experimental terraforming projects in their immediate stellar neighborhood. Nothing about the early reports suggested they would be the species that broke our taxonomy. The first anomaly was small. It was logged by an Albu cultural attaché during the third year of formal contact. The attaché noted in a routine quarterly summary that humans in conversation regularly referenced family members and colleagues who had been dead for years, sometimes decades, using verb tenses ordinarily reserved for the living. A human would say, "My father grows tomatoes," when the father had been dead for 15 years. A human would say, "My wife loves the autumn light," when the wife had died in her 30s, and the speaker was now 80. The attaché classified the practice as a linguistic peculiarity and recommended no further study. The Cultural Bureau accepted the classification. It was filed under linguistic quirk, subheading verb tense variation in mammalian communication, and forgotten. I now believe that was the first failure of categorization. I believe humans were telling us, in the most direct way their language permitted, what they were. We did not hear it because we did not have a category for what we were being told. The second anomaly came 2 years later. A human commercial agent stationed on Pelarvesh, a Thren colony, died of an industrial accident. The local administration prepared for the standard procedure: mineral bath, ceremonial slurry, integration into the appropriate garden. The human delegation refused. They refused calmly, politely, and with a degree of organizational efficiency that suggested they had anticipated the refusal might be necessary. They produced a document signed by the deceased specifying that her remains were to be returned to a city called St. Louis on the human homeworld, expense to be borne by an instrument called a will, which had been filed with a human institution called a bank before her departure from Earth 11 years prior. The Thren administration was confused. They consulted the Cultural Bureau. The Bureau consulted the human delegation, which provided a brief explanation. This was a personal preference of the deceased, common among humans, and the logistical arrangements had already been made. A human vessel would arrive within the standard interval. The remains should be preserved at standard temperature until pickup. The Bureau filed the case under sentimental custom and considered the matter resolved. The third, fourth, and fifth anomalies came in rapid succession. Each was a human who had died on a non-human world or station. Each had prearranged transport home. Each transport occurred without incident. Each was filed under sentimental custom, and the file grew thicker. By the 7th year, the Bureau noticed that every human death outside the human stellar neighborhood resulted in repatriation. Not most, not the majority, everyone. The Bureau also noticed that humans, when settling contracts and accepting postings, routinely included repatriation clauses, that human employers routinely paid for these clauses, that human insurance institutions had developed entire product categories around the eventuality, and that human estates routinely set aside funds for this purpose decades in advance of any expected need. It was at this point that Director Olmir Taz, then a junior analyst, wrote his first memo on the matter. The memo was titled "Possible Inadequacy of the Category Sentimental Custom." It was, I have been told, 12 pages long, very polite, and entirely ignored. 3 years after that memo, Vesh Lin asked her question, and Marion Holloway set down her cup. I will now describe what happened in the Hollow Atrium, because the official record is brief and procedural and does not capture what was in the room. The Hollow Atrium is a chamber of moderate size, designed for delegations of between 6 and 20 participants. It is acoustically dampened, atmospherically neutral, and lit by a slow cycling spectrum that approximates the daylight of no particular world. The seating is arranged in a shallow oval. There's no head of the table. This is an intentional feature. On that day, the human delegation numbered 4. Ambassador Marion Holloway sat at what would have been the central position if there had been a center. Beside her sat her chief of staff, a younger human male whose name I have forgotten. Behind them against the wall sat two aides whose function I did not at the time understand, and which I now believe was, at least in part, to bear witness to what their ambassador said in moments like this one. The Veteran delegation numbered 3. I sat at the position closest to Holloway. Veshlin sat to my left in the junior position. A second junior, whose name does not matter to this account, sat further along. The agenda had 2 completed items behind us: a trade tariff adjustment, a protocol revision regarding refueling rights at neutral stations. Both had been resolved with the kind of mild professional cordiality that defines the bulk of diplomatic work. Holloway was a good ambassador. She was patient, she listened carefully, she did not waste words, and she had a habit of small, courteous gestures that the Cultural Bureau had flagged as characteristic of senior human diplomats from the Western continental cultures of her homeworld. She wore a dark blue garment, simply cut. Her hair was the color of pale ash. She was, I would later learn, 61 years old by human reckoning, which is approximately the equivalent of 58 in Veteran maturity terms. The third item on the agenda was cultural exchange, open format. This was a standing item on most diplomatic schedules. It allowed junior members of either delegation to ask informal questions of their counterparts, building familiarity and trust. It was understood to be low stakes. It was where juniors practiced. I gestured for Veshlin to begin. She had prepared 3 questions. The first 2 were innocuous. Holloway answered them with a small smile she used for questions from juniors, an expression I had come to recognize as both kind and slightly amused. Then Veshlin asked the third question. She asked it in common trade speech, in the standard form, with the correct honorifics for an inquiry about practices of the body. The question, translated as nearly as I can to the spirit of the original, was this: Ambassador, how do humans honor their dead? It was a textbook question. It was the question we ask. There was no error in it. Holloway set down her cup. She did not look at Veshlin with anger. She did not look at her with confusion. She looked at her with something I now believe was recognition, as if she had been waiting for the question to be asked and was, at last, going to have to answer it for the record. She glanced briefly at her chief of staff. He gave a small nod. The 2 aides against the wall straightened slightly. The silence began. I counted. 1 breath cycle. 2. The human delegation did not move. The Veteran delegation did not move. The light cycled slowly through its meaningless spectrum. 3 breath cycles. Veshlin's antenna began to lower. 4. Then Holloway spoke. She said, "We bury our dead in the ground of the world where we were born." She paused, not for effect, but for translation. The common trade speech word she had used for ground was the correct one, but it carried in human usage weight that the word does not carry in our usage. I noticed this even at the time. I did not yet know what to do with the noticing. She continued, "We do this even when we have died very far from that ground. We carry our dead home, all of us, if we can. The cost does not matter. The time does not matter. We carry them home." She paused again. She seemed to be considering how much more to say. She decided to say more. This is true for almost every human. It is true regardless of religion. It is true regardless of nationality. It is true regardless of wealth, although wealth makes it easier. Humans who die in space have their remains preserved and shipped home, sometimes across distances that take years. Humans who die on other worlds have their remains preserved and shipped home. Humans who die in war are recovered when possible, and the recovery of war dead is in human history, one of the most consistent practices across all human cultures. The bodies of soldiers lost on battlefields 1,000 years ago are still, when found, returned to the soil of their home countries. This is not a religious practice, though it has religious expressions. It is something older than that. She looked around the room. Her gaze settled on Veshlin, who had not yet raised her antenna. "We do not feel that we have buried someone properly until they are in the ground they came from. Until then, we are not finished. We will pay any amount. We will travel any distance. We will wait any length of time. If a human dies on a planet that cannot be reached for 100 years, we will wait 100 years, and then we will go and get them. This is what we do." She picked up her cup. She did not drink from it. She held it in both hands as if she were cold, which she could not have been because the atmospheric controls of the hollow atrium are very precise. "I'm sorry," she said, "that probably was not the kind of answer you expected. I find that this question is difficult to answer briefly. We have tried in our delegations to develop a brief version. We haven't found one that we feel is honest." Veshlin raised her antenna. She did not at the time know what to say. Neither did I. The silence resumed for a shorter interval. Then I asked, because it was my responsibility to ask, the follow-up question that Veshlin should have asked if she had been able to, Ambassador. I said, forgive the question. Are you saying that every human in the galaxy intends to be returned to Earth at death? Holloway considered the question. Most of us, she said. Almost all of us. There are exceptions. Some humans choose to be buried where they died, because they came to love that place, or because they have no remaining connection to the place they were born. These exceptions are rare, they are notable. They are sometimes the subject of stories we tell our children about humans who loved a foreign place so much they chose to lie in its soil forever. We tell those stories because the choice is unusual. We tell them with admiration, but also with a kind of sorrow, because most of us, when our time comes, want to go home. She set the cup down again. I will be returned to a town called Marlborough in the state of Massachusetts on Earth. My will has been filed. The funds have been set aside since I was 28. My husband, who died 14 years ago, is already there. I will be placed in the ground next to him. This is the most ordinary thing about me. Almost every human in this delegation has a similar arrangement. Almost every human on this station does. Almost every human in the Concordant does. She looked at her aides. They nodded again, very slightly. I'm sorry, she said again. I know this is a lot. We don't usually explain it at this length. We weren't sure how to give a short answer that wouldn't be misleading. The meeting was adjourned shortly afterward. We did not return to other agenda items. There were no other agenda items. Veshlin and I walked back to our quarters together in a silence different from the one in the atrium, but related to it. I filed my report that evening. The report was 4 lines long. It was the shortest report of my career and the most difficult to write. The Cultural Bureau did not at first believe the report. This is not a criticism of the Bureau. It is a description of what happens when a category fails. The Bureau requested clarification. I provided clarification. The Bureau requested verification from the human delegation. The human delegation verified. The Bureau requested statistical data on actual practices. The data was provided. It confirmed what Holloway had said. The full scale of the human practice became visible only when the data was assembled in one place, which had never before been done. There was the Bureau discovered an entire human logistics network whose primary purpose was the repatriation of human remains across interstellar distances. This network was not operated by any single human government. It was operated by a constellation of private companies, religious organizations, mutual aid societies, family trusts, and a small number of specialized state agencies that existed in nearly every human polity. The network included refrigerated transport vessels, of which there were at the time of the data collection 312 in active service across the Concordant. It included preservation facilities at every major human station, and at most non-human stations, where humans were posted in significant numbers, of which there were 68. It included financial instruments, the will and the prepaid burial trust, and the repatriation bond, which were among the oldest and most stable financial instruments in human economic history, predating most modern human currencies. It included insurance products with combined annual premiums equivalent to the gross product of a small concordant member world. It included a guild of specialists called funeral directors in most human languages who were trained from young adulthood in the logistics, ethics, and emotional protocols of the work. The Bureau calculated that humans collectively spent every standard year an amount of wealth on the transport and burial of their dead that exceeded the entire annual expenditure of the Concordant diplomatic service. They did this without complaint. They did it as a matter of course. They considered it the basic minimum of decency. When the data was presented at the Standing Committee on Anomalous Practices, there was, I'm told, a silence in that room as well. Director Ulmer Toss, by then promoted, asked a single question: what category does this go under? No one had an answer. For 4 years, the Bureau attempted to file the human practice under existing categories. I will list the attempts because the list is, in its way, a portrait of how the Concordant thinks and of how that thinking failed. The first attempt was religious practice. This was rejected by the human delegation politely when consulted. They explained that while many human religions had teachings about burial, the underlying practice predated and exceeded those religions. Humans who held no religion whatsoever still practiced repatriation. Humans whose religions explicitly taught indifference to the location of the body still practiced repatriation. The category did not fit. The second attempt was sentimental custom. This was the category the Bureau had been using by default. The human delegation objected to it, again politely. They explained that sentimental was not the wrong word, exactly, but that it was a small word for what was being described. Sentiment, in the human languages with which the Bureau was familiar, suggested an emotional preference. The repatriation practice was not a preference. It was, the delegation said, a structural feature of how we understand belonging. The Bureau, lacking a category called structural features of belonging, did not know what to do with this clarification. The third attempt was tribal obligation, drawing on practices observed among certain Karachi clan structures. The human delegation found this category confusing. They pointed out that humans practiced repatriation across all tribal and clan lines, including across lines that were otherwise in active opposition to one another. Humans from warring nations had been observed during ceasefires to exchange war dead so that each could be returned to the appropriate soil. The category did not capture this. The fourth attempt was economic ritual. The Bureau, in some desperation, proposed that the repatriation practice might be understood as a form of distributed economic obligation, akin to certain Threat inheritance customs. The human delegation, when shown this proposal, was quiet for some time and then explained that the economic dimension was a consequence of the practice, not its source. Humans would, they said, perform the practice even at the cost of impoverishing their descendants, and had historically done so in many recorded cases. The category was insufficient. The fifth attempt was psychological coping mechanism. This was proposed by an Olbu analyst who suggested that the practice might serve a function in human grief processing. The human delegation, when presented with this category, declined it more firmly than they had declined the others. They said, through their senior cultural attaché, that they did not appreciate being told that their relationship to their dead was a coping mechanism. They asked the Bureau to consider whether the Vithrin practice of building hives from the kitten of the dead would be classified as a coping mechanism if it were practiced by another species. The Bureau did not pursue the category further. There were three more attempts: aesthetic, tradition, ancestral protocol, geographic identity marker. Each was, in its turn, returned by the human delegation with a small written correction, more in sorrow than in irritation, explaining why the category did not fit. The corrections were, I'm told, archived as a single-bound volume in the Bureau. The volume is, I'm told, surprisingly thin. The corrections were brief. The humans, it seems, did not enjoy writing them. After 4 years, Director Olmir Tas signed an order creating a new file category. The order was 3 lines long. It established a category to be used only when no existing category could accommodate a practice, and only with the approval of the director's office. The category was named after some debate belonging to place. The human file was the first entry. In the 23 years since the category was created, it has remained the only entry. I would now like to describe what the concordance slowly learned over the next 2 decades. About the implications of what we had heard in the hollow atrium, we learned that humans could not be permanently relocated. This had been, in the early years of contact, a matter of mild confusion to concordant planners, who had attempted to negotiate several large-scale resettlement projects with human governments. The projects had been declined, always politely, and the reasons given had been various and inconsistent. The concordant had assumed that the resistance was a matter of negotiation. It was not. It was a matter of structure. Humans would settle elsewhere, build colonies, work for decades or generations on distant worlds, but the colonies always eventually sent ships home. The traffic was constant and never explained because to humans it required no explanation. The dead were going home, the living were sometimes going to visit the dead. The category covered both. We learned why human colonies, even after many generations, retained a stubborn cultural orientation toward Earth that no other displaced species in our records exhibited. The Karachi, who left Korash 3,000 years ago, think of Korash, when they think of it at all, as an ancestral curiosity. The humans who left Earth 400 years ago still send their dead home. The orientation is not nostalgic, it is not symbolic, it is logistical and ongoing and considered ordinary. We learned why human military forces, when posted to distant theaters of conflict, expended what to other species seemed an irrational proportion of their resources on the recovery of casualties. We had observed this practice in early contact and classified it under military custom, which had seemed adequate. It was not adequate. The recovery was not a custom. It was the same practice in a different setting that Marion Holloway had described that day. We learned slowly that the small containers of soil that human soldiers carried on extended postings, which the Cultural Bureau had cataloged as talismans of uncertain function, were not talismans. They were partial repatriation. A human who died very far from home, in a place from which no body could be returned, could be buried with a handful of earth so that some portion of the home soil rested with them. This had been understood by humans for thousands of years. We have been looking at it for 40. We learned, most consequentially, that the species that refuses to abandon its dead is the species you cannot displace, cannot bribe with relocation incentives, cannot fragment by distributing across distant colonies, cannot conquer by capturing its homeworld, without expecting consequences none of our models had prepared for. The concordant had, for 11,000 years, managed its member species in part by managing their geographic distribution with humans. This liver did not work. Humans went where the work was, yes, but they did not stay in the way other species stayed. Their staying was provisional. Their belonging was elsewhere. Their belonging was, in every case, the same place. And they took that place with them in small containers, and they returned to that place when they died. And the entire structure of human attachment to home was, we eventually understood not a sentiment, but a fact about the species that we did not have language to describe until we built the language ourselves. The Cultural Bureau now believes, and I share the belief, that we had been speaking with humans for 47 years before we understood what they were. We had been treating them as a slightly unusual member species. They were, in fact, the only species in our records whose relationship to a specific planet could not be modified by distance, time, or incentive. They were the only species whose definition of home was, in the literal sense, a category we had to invent in order to describe. I would like to close this dispatch with a confession. I was on the day in the hollow atrium, a senior envoy. I had been in service for 41 cycles. I had attended thousands of cultural exchanges. I had heard many species explain many practices that did not initially make sense to me, and I had filed those practices appropriately and moved on. I did not, in the moment, understand what Marion Holloway was telling me. I understood the words. I understood the logistical scale once the Bureau assembled the data. I did not understand what was happening inside the humans across the table from me. I did not understand the silence. I understand it now. My bondmate, Tessic, died 11 months ago. She died on the colony at Eshrenvesh, where we had been posted for the previous 9 cycles. The arrangements after her death were the standard Vithrin arrangements, which I will not describe in detail because you know them. Her chitin was mixed into the foundational pulp of the new chambers being constructed on the eastern face of the hive complex. She is now, in the literal sense, part of the wall of a building on a colony we had served on together for less than a decade. This is honorable. It is what we do. For the first 3 months after the procedure, I went to the wall every evening and stood near it for a time. I'm told this is also common among bereaved Vithrin, though it is not part of formal custom. After the 3rd month I stopped going, the wall was a wall. It was indistinguishable from the other walls. Tessic was not in the wall particularly. She was in all the walls now, and in none of them, and the colony at Eshrenvesh was not a place we had loved, only a place we had worked, and I could not find her in it because we had not, either of us, belonged to it. I found myself 6 months after her death, wishing very intensely that I could take her somewhere. Anywhere, a place that had been ours. I tried to think of such a place and could not. We had served on 11 colonies in the course of our bond. We had loved several of them moderately. We had loved none of them in the way that humans seem to love the small towns and city districts and quiet valleys to which they ship their dead from the far ends of the galaxy. I understood then what had happened in the hollow atrium 23 years ago. The silence had not been embarrassment on the human side. It had been the slow gathering of the will to explain something that the explainer knew would not be fully heard. The silence on our side had been the first edge of an incomprehension we did not yet know we were experiencing. We had heard the words, "We bury our dead in the ground of the world where we were born," and we had not heard, because we could not hear, that this was a description of a structural property of an entire species. That a billion humans dying every century, were every one of them, in every case, going to be returned to one particular planet, and that this was not unusual to them, not extraordinary, not heroic. It was the basic minimum. I sat in the hollow atrium and heard a woman describe calmly the most consequential difference between her species and every other species in the concordant, and I filed a 4-line report and went to dinner. I did not know. I have spent the 23 years since learning, and I'm still learning, and I will, I think, be learning until they mix my chitin into wall somewhere I have not yet been posted. I will write one more thing, and then I will close. I believe the concordant will not outlast the humans. I do not mean this as criticism of the concordant. I have served it for 64 cycles, and I love it as much as a Vithan can love an institution. I mean, it is observation. The concordant is a structure for species that move. Its assumption, refined over 11,000 years, is that civilization is something that disperses, distributes, accepts the rearrangement of its citizens across the stars and adapts. By this assumption, the concordant has succeeded magnificently. 247 species have joined. None has left, the trade lanes are stable, the shape holds, humans do not move in the way the concordant assumes movement happens. They go where the work is, yes. They send their children to distant colonies, yes. They serve on stations in worlds far from Earth, yes. But they are not, in the structural sense, displaced by any of this. They remain attached to the place from which they came, attached in a way that cannot be unmade by distance, attached in a way that the concordant did not know was possible until the data was assembled and the category was invented. A species like this can wait. A species like this does not panic when its colonies are far from home, because home is not a colony. Home is the place where the bodies go. A species like this will, I believe, still be sending its dead to a small planet circling a yellow star 10,000 years from now, long after the concordance tidy categories have softened and the trade lanes have shifted and the rest of us have forgotten what world we came from. The humans will not forget. They have built an entire civilization on not forgetting. It is what they do. The silence in the hollow atrium 23 years ago was the sound of two species recognizing, without yet understanding, that one of them was the kind of species the other had never met. I have been thinking about that silence ever since. I will likely think about it until I'm part of a wall on a colony I have not yet visited. I'm sending this dispatch because the archives should have a record. I do not know what category to file it under. I leave that to you. If it helps, you may file it next to the human file. In the category we invented for them, the one that has only one entry, perhaps now it will have two. With respect and with greeting to all chambers of the Third Petition House, Senior Envoy Kesik Vor, Concordant Spiral, the 23rd year after the silence,